operation goes on all the time. Homeless people are driven out, intimidated, patrolled and controlled. Poor racialized communities receive precisely the same treatment. Indigenous people, black youth. I mean, that kind of vicious social control with massively racist elements to it is the normal way in which the police function.
I think people have the capacities to see through the deceit in which they're ensnared, but they got to make the effort.
Hey, welcome to Propa-Ganada, where we firmly but politely challenge corporate power in Canada. Now, living in a capitalist system, the only way we can really have any real power is to organize. It's kind of organized money versus organized humans. And my guest I talked to in this interview is John Clarke. And John's originally from England, and he did a lot of organizing work in Toronto in really low-income communities, fighting back against some of the neoliberal austerity policies that were coming in over the last 3 decades. In our interview today, he kind of talks a little bit about some of the strategies and organizing techniques that had some successes, as well as some of the other challenges that we're really facing now. So I hope you enjoyed the episode. Please like and subscribe to the channel and share with your networks. Thanks a lot.
So I remember seeing that in the early days, there was in one of the, I think the early, a conference when the OCAP was first being formed, there was kind of a deliberation between going the lobbying approach towards pressuring government to versus a more grassroots mobilizing of people who are living in poverty. And it sounds like the direction that was the second direction, the latter. Can you kind of talk about that decision?
Yeah, it was a really, I mean, at the time we had a founding meeting. We had a pretty large crowd at the Board of Education in Toronto. It was I forget how many, a couple of hundred people or something. And it seemed like an important discussion, but we didn't realize at the time how important. Right. I mean, there was, as you say, essentially two visions put forward. One was a kind of a concerned citizens body that would, focus on public education and lobbying and getting on first name terms with the assistant deputy ministers and all that kind of stuff. And then there was the sort of notion that we would actually organize from the base up a movement of poor people, and that primarily it would use tactics of collective action to try to actually give poor communities under attack some political power. And it was quite a bitter discussion, and it sort of came down to I was actually the candidate for organizer for the second position, and It came down to quite a bitter discussion, so much so that when the decision was made on which way we would go, I think about a good third of the room got up and walked out.
Is that right?
Yeah, wow. Which is from there. I mean, I give them credit. I think they made the right decision. So, yeah. So it was. That was the defining moment for us, and at least it set us on the right course, I think, or the left course, as the case may be.
Yeah. Throughout the years when you were at OCAP, having this, having it in the DNA of the organization, being rooted in people who are experiencing poverty in the day-to-day, how did that inform decisions made? And I know this is a pretty big question, but how did that really, and having the capacity to get people out into the street and they're kind of fighting for their own life, like literally fighting for their lives, how did that flavor the decision-making process?
Well, I mean, it shaped us in a lot of ways. I mean, it shaped us, first of all, in terms of how we related to poor communities. So, as I say, right at the beginning, we realized that we couldn't just be this, esoteric body that was sort of issuing pronouncements on poverty and organizing periodic events that didn't seem to particularly be relevant in people's lives. We realized we had to make a difference in people's lives. And if you go into a poor community and start organizing, people don't come to you because they're looking for a different social vision, although they may be looking for a different social vision. But the main point of contact is usually somebody has turned off my electricity, or the local welfare office has told me that I didn't put in a form on the right date and therefore I'm going to have to go without income, those kinds of things.
Right.
So what we started to do was to use methods of collective action to actually resolve people's individual grievances. And a little bit tongue-in-cheek, we referred to it as direct action casework. And so we started doing that in communities, and it started to, it's a very immediate way of demonstrating the power of collective action. You haven't just gone to Queen's Park and made speeches, not that I'm sneering at rallies that do that, but what you've done is you've actually got somebody a check, or you've got somebody's utilities turned back on, or you've got an employer who wasn't going to pay them to cough up. And those are things that make an immediate, obvious difference. So that rooted us. And then the other thing is, that we actually started to build a membership directly in the communities affected. And that also started to shape the way in which we organized and the way in which we related to communities. So having that, being an organization of the poor became a definite reality for us.
Right. And so, Toronto is a very vibrant community with lots of people from different, backgrounds. So how did this organizing, how did people with different kind of, let's say white, people of different colors, was there tensions, and how were those tensions resolved? How did people kind of come together to kind of fight for a common economic policies?
Yes, I would say that, and here I think is I think I would have to acknowledge that in the period in which we started to organize, you started to see the anti-globalization movement starting to really, in the 90s, you're seeing this sort of upsurge of challenging the globalization agenda. And a lot of that was sort of, as the term in the day that was used, was summit hopping. People would go to this or that event of these reprehensible people that were gathering in whatever city and condemn them. And that was all very good. But a lot of people, the best, I think, people within that movement were saying there has to be something more than that. There has to actually be a way of rooting yourselves in actual day-to-day struggles in people's lives. So we got a lot of people from the anti-globalization movement that became involved. And it's fair to say that the organization, they were great people, but the organization, I think, reflected the fact that these were disproportionately white people, disproportionately middle-class people. And OCAP has always had an enormous, a base of people in communities that reflected what poverty is in Toronto and looked like the face of poverty in Toronto. Right. But we did suffer from that tension, I think, between long-term people being disproportionately white, often originally from middle-class backgrounds, playing a disproportionate role. That remained a tension for a long time in the organization. And it was an important consideration, I think, a very, very important consideration. But at the same time, we were able to make inroads in communities that really were the sort of the real presence of poverty. So, for example, for a long time, we had an organization called OCAP Women of Etobicoke, made up entirely, overwhelmingly of Somali women who were heading up that organization. So yes, a lot of really patient organizing work in which we got rooted in communities. The absolutely defining thing about the growth of poverty has been that it has been since the 1970s, let me say, when we begin to see what we could call a neoliberal agenda starting to emerge, is what you get is a situation where the neoliberal project was always about increasing the rate of exploitation, right? That was fundamentally what it was about. By the 70s, the post-war boom had come to an end. And rates of profit for capitalist enterprises were actually had fallen significantly, and they recognized that they had to increase the level of exploitation. And to do that, they have to get more unpaid labor out of workers. And you can do that by working people harder, or you can do that by cutting wages effectively, or both.
Right.
And so there was an enormous growth of low wage precarious work, and poverty was a major weapon in that regard. So particularly cutting things like unemployment insurance and welfare became a way of creating that climate of desperation that forced people to scramble for the lowest paying jobs on offer. And the destruction of all the elements of the social wage were part of that. So at the same time, you had the creation of what we might call the neoliberal city, where there was an extreme commodification of housing. So 93 federally, and in Ontario 95 provincially, you get governments pulling out of any commitment to social housing. And then you get this process of extreme commodification in the private market, with rents being driven up, and the options for housing for the poor cut further and further into. So you have a huge growth of homelessness, and you have a huge growth of the precariously housed, and you have working class people spending far more of their income on housing than they ever did before. And that's been an absolute defining feature of this agenda over the last 50 years or so.
Right. And so if I were a landlord, if I were a large scale landlord, I would probably want a certain degree of homelessness, right, to keep demand for my apartments higher, right? I want to be able to select as many of a large pool of people, right? Kind of like a labor pool for a job. Yes. So the logic of capitalism likes joblessness and it likes homelessness to a degree. Am I right?
Yes, I think that's true. You have a situation now in Ontario where precisely because they changed the rent control system, you also have a direct incentive for landlords to contribute to the manufacture of homelessness, because there are rent controls in place, but they don't apply when a unit changes hands. So that means if a tenant moves out, the rent controls don't stay. The landlord is then in a position to charge a different rent. So what that has created is, if you're a landlord, or you're not, but let's say you are a landlord, and you've got yourself a big apartment block. Yeah. And in that apartment block, over the years, people have moved out, and you've been able to increase the rent. But let's say you've got 10% of your tenants who are these stubborn old buggers who've been in there for years, right, and you can't get them out. And their rent is ridiculously low as far as you're concerned compared to other people, because they've remained protected by rent control. Right. So you want to get them out desperately. So you start to come up with all these ways of making life unpleasant for them and trying to push them out. So the rent control over a period, when it was introduced by the Mike Harris government, the Liberals said they were committed to changing it, but they never did. So that's remained one of the great driving forces of injustice in the rental market in Toronto,
right,
in Ontario.
So for those of us who are not really familiar with the inner workings of a municipal government, can you explain if a movement was trying to get some policy passed in City Hall, in Toronto or in Ottawa or wherever it is, what are the intricacies of that? Do you know what I mean?
Right. Well, I mean, since you mentioned specifically the municipal level of government, right, I think it's important to say that level of government is more than any other the level of government that serves the needs of that part of the capitalist class that are invested in property. So that's the big question at the municipal level of government. So when you're looking to improve the rights of homeless people, or you're looking to improve tenants' rights, or you're looking to resist evictions, or any of those considerations, you're coming up against a kind of an executive committee for landlords and property developers. And with various nuances, you have at the far left of the spectrum, which is probably not that far left in terms of the overall political spectrum, you would have a section of councillors who are relatively sympathetic to the notion that things should be as just as possible, and then you have the sort of the gung-ho champions of inequality who just revel in it. But you're dealing with collectively a body of politicians and and a set of institutions that you can't consider to be your friend.
Right.
So we sort of fall back. I mean, the basic concept we have, going back to the original founding meeting of OCAP that you talked about, we based a lot of our organizing methods on the kind of stuff that the unemployed movement did in the 1930s. Bringing delegations to welfare offices, trying to stop people being evicted. Those kinds of things were the sort of the perspective that we had. And then some years after we'd been doing it, we came across a book written by these two American writers, Francis Fox Piven and Richard A. Cloud. And one of their books, called Poor People's Movement, they come up with this proposition, which is that the main way in which the poor can have political influence is through their ability to create crises by disrupting institutions. Which, I mean,
hit them in the wallet, right?
Yeah, and do so in ways that are both economically disruptive, but ways that also create political crisis. So, I mean, that's the main way, in our view, in which the poor can have political influence. I mean, poor people obviously can't threaten to take their investments somewhere else. They have to find a way. Collective action and disruptive collective action is the main way in which the poor can get concessions, where they can win victories. And so that's true of a bureaucracy, and it's true of a level of government. But the question is, in the context of a escalating and intensifying hostile agenda, such as we've been dealing with during the years of our existence, we've won some skirmishes, but by and large, and not OCAP alone by any manner of means, we've been fighting a defensive battle against an agenda that's been actually, on the whole, making things worse.
So we talked about how a certain amount of homelessness and a certain amount of unemployment is perfectly acceptable and probably desired in a capitalist system. But then there's this contradiction where we also, not we, but the powers that be also want a city that is clean and sanitized of those dirty homeless people. And so I believe it was the Safe Streets Act, was it in 1990? These new laws basically giving fines to people who are panhandling and criminalizing homelessness. And I was wondering if you could speak a bit about this increase of policing of the homeless population. And also, I know there's carding in other communities, predominantly people of color.
The Safe Streets Act was a measure that was introduced by the Harris Tories. It was particularly problematic for people who squeegeed, who went to cars with squeegees, because it was directly banned. So it created a huge problem there. With regards to people who panhandle, who asked for change, it was a somewhat more indirect thing, in the sense that the Supreme Court has held that you cannot ban panhandling. That's a Supreme Court decision, but curiously, it's not based on that you have any right to have income and survive. It's that panhandling is a protected form of free expression. So you have free speech even if you have no right to actually have food in your belly. But nonetheless, they couldn't directly ban it, but they introduced a whole series of outrageous restrictions, targeting what they called aggressive panhandling, and you couldn't panhandle within so many feet of a automatic bank teller and all these kinds of things, and it was supposed to be illegal to panhandle if you were under the influence of alcohol or a drug and this sort of stuff. So the Safe Streets Act is one of their weapons, and a fairly major one, and it's of course used by the police, so it's used outrageously, unfairly by its own terms, so that we have people come into our office in OCAP who had been given tickets for aggressive panhandling, who were like sitting on the street mildly and meekly minding their own business. We even had people given panhandling tickets when they weren't even panhandling. So it's just used as a kind of it's used as a tool, but before and since, and if the Safe Streets disappeared tomorrow, as it should, it wouldn't fundamentally change the role of the police. Which, I mean, I'll give you one example drawn from my own experiences. I was one day going down Queen Street West, and I see a man I see a man sitting in a park being given a ticket by a cop. So I go over to see what's going on. The cop's just getting on his motorcycle and just going as I arrive. So this is a 78-year-old man who's been given a ticket for camping in the park without a permit. Now, he's sitting fully clothed, and if it's a major concern of anybody's, fully sober, and he's sitting next to a folded up, closed duffel bag. So there's in no way could any realistic observer say that he was camping. He was just sitting on the grass. But the cop told him quite clearly that he was doing it because the local business owners didn't want homeless people in the park. Now, the incredible thing about that is, from the standpoint of sort of the liberal theories, that officer was outrageously violating the law. Not only did he have no reasonable and probable grounds to act as he acted against that man, but in fact, theoretically, he should have been defending his right to be in the park. Right. I mean, that's the way the law is supposed to work. He wasn't committing any criminal act. He wasn't doing anything improper. The notion that people with money could demand that he be removed, and that a servant of the state would fabricate some reason to remove him because rich people didn't like him and he was poor, is supposedly a violation of all the rules. And yet it's normal practice. It's exactly how they function all the time. A staff sergeant with the 52 Division in Toronto told me once that he thought his most important job as a police officer was to keep the streets clean of vagrants so as to preserve the investment climate for businesses. I mean, he couldn't put it more...
The poor laws, right?
Yeah, the poor laws, and he couldn't put it in more sort of overtly class terms. And that operation goes on all the time. Homeless people are driven out, intimidated, patrolled and controlled. Poor racialized communities receive precisely the same treatment. Indigenous people, black youth. I mean, that kind of vicious social control with massively racist elements to it is the normal way in which the police function. And the keeping the lid on the homeless problem means, as much as possible, keeping people intimidated and keeping people as invisible as possible. And so that's basically the function. And the Safe Streets Act and carding and those things are weapons, but they're only weapons that are available. If they weren't available, they'd use different tactics. Right.
Now, when people say, "Oh, why aren't these guys finding work? Why can't they work? Why can't they? They just got to work hard enough." The rugged individualism, pull yourself up by your boots or whatever, bootstraps. Let's talk about actual employment opportunities and the disconnect between what people might think is the reality and what's actually going on. Are you able to speak to that at all?
Well, yeah. I mean, you mentioned the poor laws, and I think it goes back to the basic notion of the poor laws, is that so the way the poor laws emerge is that you have 1500s in England. You have the peasants being driven off the land by a process of legalized theft and murder. People are expelled from land that they and their families have been on for 1,000 years.
Right.
And so this creates a huge problem of landless, homeless, and we may be sure extremely pissed off people who have to be dealt with. And the state at first just tries to deal with it as a law and order problem. With brutal legislation, up to and including flogging and hanging for people being unemployed, introduced. But then they recognize that they have no choice but to introduce some kind of level of provision. And so they established the poor laws with workhouses. And the whole idea of the workhouses is that they will be calculatedly degrading and punitive. That's the whole basic idea behind them. They're designed to be as humiliating, as degrading as they can. So it's necessary that the poor are turned into pariahs. And it's necessary that those people who are working people but are slightly above them in terms of social standing look down on them with contempt. And it's all part of the same mechanism. And that principle, I would say, is still basically the governing principle with regards to this sort of demonization of the poor that exists. And of course, there are poor people who have for various medical reasons or by reasons of disability are unable to access the job market. There are times of high unemployment when people are not able to find work. But actually, the experience of most, of a great percentage of poor people is in fact often working, but working for extremely low wages. Most people who are poor are actually waged workers, and that has increased. And you even have the phenomenon in homeless shelters of staff waking people up so they can report for their work shifts. So I mean, it's just I think it's a very carefully cultivated myth of the architect of your own misery, and you're poor because of moral failings. It goes way back, and it's alive today.
Right. It's so absurd to think that in order to have a house, like a roof over your head, or to have food in your stomach, that you have to sell your labor. There's it could be a more socialist society would say, okay, let's provide what is needed for all the population, and I guess that's kind of what the goal is, right? That's what we're trying to fight for.
Well, yes, I mean, certainly. I mean, we want a society in which people are able to contribute. I mean, so many people in this society are denied the opportunity to contribute. It's very far from it being, I think, a major problem of people who just lack the motivation to. Actually, what we do, we live in a society more than anything that I think that undervalues people and denies people their capacity to contribute.
Right.
I mean, one of my all-time favorite and most powerful quotes is the statement that Stephen Jay Gould made when he said that I'm somehow less interested in the convolutions of Einstein's brain than the near certainty that women and men of equal talent lived and died in cotton fields and sweatshops. And so, in fact, it's the denial of talent and ability and the ability to contribute that marks this society, not some incredible capacity for people to loaf off. That's I think that's if there's a great deal of loafing off that goes on, it's usually people with a considerable amount of resources behind
on a golf course. Yeah. So I wanted to let's talk about the pandemic, and let's talk about the economic crisis that started from the pandemic and how that's affected people living in poverty.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a huge consideration. I mean, the pandemic. I think it's important to say this: that the pandemic has triggered and intensified a crisis, but by no means is it the only factor in that crisis. Right? I mean, you've got first of all, if you look at what's been happening in the economy, I spoke of the transfer over to a neoliberal agenda to try to increase the rate of exploitation. The neoliberal period was, generally speaking, an expanding period of economic expansion, where they did manage to partially restore the rates of profit, although not to the level that took place during the boom years following the Second World War. But they restored the rates of profit. They opened up whole new areas of the world, particularly China, to capitalist the supply chain.
Yeah.
They increased the rate of exploitation incredibly. But 2007, you get the financial crash.
Yeah.
You get the financial crisis, and following that, the Great Recession. And then after that, you get a period of more than a decade of the most sluggish recovery, with rates of profit not being restored and productive investment not taking place. The big story at the moment is the asset bubble that's been created through the financial dealings, because the money that's been put into priming the pump of the economy is being spent on the stock exchange. So you've got now this situation of before the pandemic struck, before the first person in Wuhan got sick, you already had an unfolding economic downturn that was gathering momentum. And then all of a sudden you get the pandemic that takes it just to an entirely different level. There's enormous economic disruption. Lockdowns are forced on governments. Huge levels of the population, huge percentages of the population are unable to go to work. It's a devastating downturn. What it's leaving is what the International Monetary Fund refers to as economic scarring. So the damage being done at this time globally is incredible. The numbers of people living on the edge of starvation has skyrocketed. Even in rich countries, you're seeing food bank lineups that are shocking. You're seeing tens and tens of thousands of people, millions of people in North America, facing the prospect of eviction from their housing. Yeah. And then you're seeing, as well as this enormous suffering, with even the resolution of the pandemic unclear at this point with variants and what have you, but once the pandemic is cleared away, assuming we don't get another one, we're then going to be dealing with a period of incredible, the impact in terms of the economic downturn is, I think, going to continue. And we're going to see a situation where what's really going to be on the agenda is the big question is going to be who pays for this crisis. Right. This enormous public health and economic crisis, and hanging over it all, of course, an even bigger ecological crisis, the effects of which are starting to escalate massively and impact people's lives in the most dreadful ways, and it's only at relatively early stages and it's coming fast. Mm-hmm. So for all those reasons, I think we've entered a period of crisis like we've never seen before. Comparisons are made to the 1930s, but I don't think even that is an adequate comparison. I think there has been an absolutely historic change, and the war on the poor is going to intensify enormously. So I think that poses questions in terms of the way society is, but it poses enormous questions as well in terms of resistance and struggle and social movements and the ways we've got to organise in the face of that. I mean, I think we've got to think in terms of mass movements. I think we've got to think in terms of building resistance on a scale that we've never been able to build before, but now perhaps we can. And we've got to be thinking in terms as well of actually advancing ideas of a different kind of society. And we've got to actually put that at the forefront. The idea of being a socialist was always sort of, that you recognise that, there weren't that many people that thought like you, and you said it. But I think people's life experiences is changing that. I think people are understanding that it can't go on this way. People can't live in this kind of a world organised in this way. And so I think the possibility of actually engaging in struggles that are mass struggles, but that are also transformative struggles, are really gigantic questions at the moment. So the kind of stuff that we're talking about with regards to my experiences in OCAP, they were important, and they created a certain model, and it's something to build upon those kinds of experiences. But we've got to organise now in ways that just go so far beyond anything that we've done before. I think that's the challenge.